Good evening and welcome to the University Lecture. My name's Emma Sparks. I'm Rector and Dean at UNSW Canberra. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us both in person and online today. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are joining us. This is my first university lecture since joining UNSW Canberra, and it's my pleasure to be part of what has become an annual tradition. Tonight's event marks 30 years since the first iteration of the university lecture, and it's attracted a stellar lineup of speakers since its inception in 1992. The campus-wide lecture has always been open to all staff and students. Last year, we delivered the lecture online due to the ACT lockdown, and we extended our invitation to the public for the very first time. We're out of lockdown, but we're delighted to continue the tradition of bringing the university lecture to a wider audience. We also continue the tradition of welcoming an outstanding speaker to the university. Tonight, it's our pleasure to welcome Jennifer Wittwer. Jennifer is an international expert, author and speaker on gender and women, peace and security, with more than 40 years military experience in leading people through organisational change, large-scale cultural and workplace reform. She's an advocate for women's rights, equality and empowerment, and works closely with the United Nations and other prominent international organisations on gender mainstreaming in the security sector. Jennifer has led the implementation of the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda within the Australian Defence Force and the broader defence and security sector. She has participated in various NATO and UN forums and projects relating to women, peace and security in the armed forces. She deployed as a first ADF gender advisor to NATO operations in Afghanistan in 2013. In her final role with the ADF, Jennifer was seconded to UN Women in New York as a policy specialist on peacekeeping and sexual exploitation and abuse. Since then, Jennifer has been contracted to UN Women Ukraine and also UN Women Jordan. Tonight, Jennifer will discuss gender-responsive leadership and its role in the UN's efforts to promote gender equality in peacekeeping missions. Women continue to make up just 7.8% of all uniformed military, police and justice and corrections personnel in missions. Reports of sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by peacekeepers remain prevalent. In this evening's lecture, Jennifer will explain how gender-responsive leadership can bring about the transformational change that's needed to respond to and mitigate the gendered inequalities that shape peacekeeping outcomes. Jennifer says a gender-responsive leader, attuned to these inequalities, actively works towards equality for women, men, and other genders in the workplace and in operations. We're excited to hear more about Jennifer's work and learn from her expertise in this important field. It's my pleasure to welcome Jennifer Wittwer to the lectern.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much, Professor Sparks, for that very warm introduction. What an awesome crowd. Probably my toughest audience yet, I reckon. But thank you very much for having me here tonight. Distinguished guests, University of New South Wales and Australian Defence Force Academy staff and cadets and midshipmen, online guests and my own guests here tonight. Indeed, it's a privilege and honour to be here and speak tonight at this eminent lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight and honour their elders past and present, and I also acknowledge and honour any First Nations people in the room or online. I actually feel very humbled to be here. I can't say that I'm an ADFA alumni. I joined the Navy before women were permitted to undertake degree studies in the Australian Defence Force. But I can say as a student completing my final master's thesis, which by the way is analysing the effectiveness of gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping to achieve gender equality for uniformed women peacekeepers, I'm actually in awe of all of you, and maybe just a little bit jealous as you complete your degrees as part of your military or civilian leadership careers. And I guess what are our university studies for if we don't use them as a platform from which we can learn, develop and enhance our leadership capability. And I believe it's as equally important for me as a mature age student as it is for you to see that what you will learn here will set the stage for the leader that you will become and the leadership that you will need to meet the challenging and complex situations and events that will define your military service or civilian careers. So it'll come as no surprise to those of you who know me that I'm a feminist and very passionate about gender equality. And this is because equality and the exercise of human rights is not something that all women and other gender identities around the world today enjoy. And more so, this is an issue in conflict and post-conflict environments which heightens existing gender inequalities, patriarchal hierarchies and structures, and gender-based violence. And I think we only need to see what's been happening in Afghanistan and the actions of the Taliban over the past year to see how fragile rights and equality are. So we as military or defence folk have a role to play in addressing this issue. Tonight I'm talking about gender-responsive leadership in peacekeeping and deployments as an essential component of mission success. I am glad to see that the new Defence Minister lifted the previous government's ban on ADF events that celebrate diversity. Because how can we not acknowledge the diversity within our ranks here at home and be at the forefront of doing so in peace and security efforts overseas? I will conclude with some practical tips you can take away and some reflections from a senior ADF officer on what he called his gender awakening and his subsequent gender-responsive leadership in the operational environment. I will caveat this lecture with the fact that I will be touching on many concepts, of which there is not a lot of time to explore, and some will be a little bit provocative and maybe challenging. But the purpose of my topic is to give you an overview from which hopefully it may, and excuse the pun, engender a desire to further your own knowledge a bit later. Now, it's a timely topic given that today is the 75th anniversary of Australians in peacekeeping, with their first deployment to a peace operations in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, in 1947. And since then, more than 66,000 Australian military, police and civilian women and men have served in over 50 international operations, in which tragically 16 have lost their lives. In speaking about a very nuanced aspect of leadership that responds to the changed nature of conflict, which I will describe shortly, I don't make light of the sacrifice made by these Australians, and nor do my comments in any way reflect judgment on the behaviour or conduct of these peacekeepers. In fact, Australian peacekeepers are very highly regarded for their professionalism and expertise, and I don't believe that there's one instance of an allegation of serious misconduct by our peacekeepers over the 75 years of service. And I have no doubt the ADF will continue to enjoy this reputation. But it does behove us to ensure that we can adapt to and lead responses to change, a change in the ways that conflict is waged, a change in the consequences of conflict and whom it impacts, and a change in the way we view ourselves in the broader world. I want you to picture this simple scenario. You're a military observer in a United Nations or UN mission in a post-conflict setting in Africa, and you patrol a local town at the same time that aid is delivered by another UN agency. And you observe that it is mostly men that are lined up to receive the aid and wonder, because you might be slightly attuned to their absence, where are the women? So at some point, you move your patrol to the local outlying villages to the town and dispatch yourself, if you're a woman, or a woman peacekeeper from a team to go and talk to the local women, most often something that only women peacekeepers can do. And they report back that women don't come into town to collect aid because of the need to traverse a distance to town, during which time they're at high risk of being raped or kidnapped by local militia. And you also find out that often the aid does not get to the homes of these women and girls, sometimes because it's stolen by the militia and sometimes because the men choose to use it for themselves. So you negotiate with the aid agency to make short delivery stops in the local villages with your team as security, to provide an opportunity for the women to access the aid and to do so safely, thus avoiding further harm to an already traumatised group. Now, this is a simple scenario. It demonstrates, firstly, the importance of understanding the gender dynamics at play in that culture at the local level, and secondly, what you can do to facilitate equal outcomes for all members of that community. The nuance in this story is that equal access to the aid was achieved, but by different means for women and men because of their gendered roles, because of male power hierarchies, and because of limitations on movement due to the risk of violence. But first I want to be clear about what gender means, as I know people perpetuate myths and misunderstandings, and this is something that we really can't afford to do in peacekeeping or deployed settings. Gender does not mean women. The use of the word gender first came about around about the 1960s from the women's rights movement, and later in the development space, to address the historical disadvantages experienced by women. But they came to realise that it was not women's responsibility to redress this disadvantage, but rather for development interventions to focus on the unequal and highly gendered power relations that exist between men and women in society. So because of these reasons, gender is not defined by biological sex, male and female. Gender refers to social and cultural differences in roles, expectations, and access to power and resources, and it can denote a range of identities that do not correspond to established ideas of female and male. Most cultures use a gender binary in which gender is divided into two categories, boys and men, and girls and women, and those who exist outside that group may fall under the term non-binary, and in some societies these are often referred to as third genders and fourth genders, etc. And in fact, often in peacekeeping, uniformed women peacekeepers are often referred to by local communities as third genders, as women in what they see as men's uniforms. And this actually gives rise to opportunities for women to extend their community reach to male community leaders. Most scholars agree that gender is a central characteristic for social organisation, where there's an established pattern of relationships between people that reflects historical, cultural, and known behaviour that they associate with a biological sex. In the main, this is the dominance of men and the subordination of women. Now, while we may not feel that that's necessarily the case here, and a debate about that would be a topic for another lecture, it does remain the reality for many others around the world. We've also seen that gender is related to cultural traditions in society, and it can vary by community, country, or region. We therefore need to understand and recognise also the intersections that cut across these binaries, including race, culture, sexual identity, colour, religion, and so on. Peacekeepers often operate in environments that are less culturally, legally, or politically accepting of sexual and gender identities and other intersections. And LGBTIQ+ peacekeepers can also face discriminations and risks from within peace operations, including from members of other national contingents. As peacekeepers, you will face colleagues and those in the community who reflect these identities and intersections, and it gives you an opportunity to challenge the expression, "Things are not as they are, but as we are." Now, secondly, gender equality doesn't mean treating or making everyone the same, but that they are afforded equal value and have equal access to resources, opportunities, and power. So look at the person sitting next to you. They might be wearing the same uniform, they might have their hair styled the same way, they may be the same rank, but underneath that sameness lies difference and distinction in background, in perspectives, in experiences, and in intersections. Gender equality is also not about women, other gender identities, or marginalised groups conforming to the dominant group. Rather, it's about the dominant group allowing the space for those minority groups to access the same opportunities, resources, and power and to express themselves in authentic ways. It's in recognising and accommodating the differences and potentially the historical or traditional disadvantages experienced by some that leads to equality. Now, the nature of armed conflict has changed considerably over the last century. At the beginning of the 20th century, civilian victims of armed conflicts accounted for approximately 5% of all deaths. And during the First World War, that rose to about 15%, mainly due to hunger and disease. By the end of the Second World War, estimates climbed to 65%, partly due to hunger and disease, but also due in large part to the indiscriminate bombing of cities, and sadly that's of course something that we've been seeing in the Ukraine. Since the early 1990s, armed conflict has changed from predominantly interstate conflicts to intrastate conflicts, and in response the UN has transitioned from traditional to multi-dimensional peace operations to support the maintenance, monitoring and building of peace and the prevention of violent conflict. This multi-dimensional approach also addresses issues relevant to protecting local populations through an improved understanding of the local culture, religious beliefs, customs and ways of life. And such an approach facilitates the implementation of new security paradigms which recognise that a gendered approach is essential to adequately respond to the needs of women, men, boys and girls who have all been affected differently by armed conflict. Civilians now represent anywhere from 75 to 90% of the total victims of these conflicts, and of these civilians, 75 to 85% are women and children. Worse than simply being incidental victims or collateral damage, rebel groups and local, national and international militias and armed forces specifically target women. Women are abducted, sexually exploited and abused, mutilated, trafficked and detained as sexual slaves or bargaining chips by rebel groups even after a conflict has ended. And there are long-lasting consequences for women and girls. We only have to recall the kidnapping of the teenage schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria in 2014 by the Boko Haram, with the leader announcing his intention to sell them into slavery. And where they were eventually released, many girls were rejected by their communities and their families, in part due to a culture of stigma around sexual violence. And just this issue alone adds another dimension to already complex conflict situations. Women's abuse has also been at the hands of male UN peacekeepers, both military and civilian, more prominently from the 1990s after peacekeeping became multidimensional and broadened the scope of peacekeeping activities. Scholars claim that much of this was, and still is, based on individual peacekeepers' perceived rights as soldiers, peacekeepers, and as men, which highlights the privilege and power that they hold within masculinized environments. This maltreatment usually is an exacerbated version of the extensive gender inequalities and the existing patterns of gender-based violence against women that existed prior to the armed conflict. These patterns are often due to gender-related stereotypes and roles allocated to genders which, along with gender relations, are destabilised by the social upheaval that comes with conflict. And often these patterns are not recognised or addressed by the traditional, mainstream, gender-blind understandings of conflict and reconstruction. And this is true for misconceptions about women's and men's roles in conflict. Women are not only victims or agents of peace, they can also participate in combat. And men are not just soldiers, they can also be victims of sexual and other gender-based violence. Therefore, understanding these gendered impacts of conflict and utilising the resources of peacekeepers to assist these affected communities to achieve gender equality has become a priority for those organisations responsible for peacekeeping. Increasingly, as the world has learned more about the evolving nature of conflict, wars, and contemporary warfare, and their impact on men, women, and other genders, gender-responsive leadership is emerging as a key factor in the ability of peacekeeping missions to achieve their mandate. So in respect to contemporary peace operations, I want to say this up front. If you don't learn about the culture of the community that you're deploying to, if you don't understand the gendered and social roles that exist in that community, and quite frankly, and I'm going to use the F word here, if you're not a feminist, then you have no business being there. And let me call out the elephant in the room. I'm sure for some of you that the word feminism recalls bra-burning women of the 60s and 70s. This is true, but of course, if not for them, we women in the room would not be here tonight. But in its purest form, feminism is merely a movement or ideology that aims to establish equality between women and men. It does, however, incorporate the position that society prioritises men's perspective and that women are treated unjustly in these societies. And this, of course, comes from the historical structures and hierarchies established long before women were permitted to work outside the home. Now, while you may feel this is not the case here, it does remain a prominent feature of conflict environments and for other national military contingents with whom you may work. Many armed forces don't allow women in combat roles. Some don't allow women to join as enlisted personnel, while others only allow women to join in a small range of roles. And of course, some militaries don't allow women to join at all. In peacekeeping, feminism is reflected in the mission's efforts to fight against these gender stereotypes and create outcomes for women and others that are equal to men. Peacekeeping is no longer the domain of traditional military skill sets, and it requires so much more to address the changing security needs of women, men, boys, girls, and other gender identities. The purpose of peacekeeping is to create a positive political atmosphere that will facilitate negotiations between hostile parties. UN staff, under the scope of the mission mandate, must help the local population change social inequalities and avoid previous discriminations, such as women's lack of access to decision-making and education. To do this, missions and their staff must integrate a gender perspective. Gender perspective looks at the impact that gender roles, stereotypes, and attributions have on people's opportunities and social relations. It focuses particularly on gender-based differences in status and power, and considers how such discrimination shapes the immediate and long-term needs of women, men, and others. In the case of changing gender roles in conflict settings that I mentioned earlier, applying a gender perspective provides a more accurate picture of what needs to be done to improve equality on the ground. In doing so, missions have the capacity to engage with host government counterparts, including leaders in the security sector and government institutions. Missions can influence the development of policies and laws to support gender equality and create environments conducive to women's and others' meaningful and equal participation in peace and security efforts. And now, while this approach does have some challenges, because it does rely on the political will of the host government, it does provide opportunities for the mission itself to role model its own gender equality and gender equity measures and progress. Of course, we wouldn't know why we do this without understanding history. Addressing gender inequality and integrating a gender perspective into peace and security efforts has actually been long on the agenda of the international community, and it stems from decades of activism, feminism, and policy development on women's rights and discrimination. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the lengthy history behind this approach. Again, I think that's a topic for another day. But I do want to highlight three key international instruments that affirmed early on that gender equality and gender responsiveness are essential to sustainable peace and security. The first one is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, which was adopted in 1979. And CEDAW requires UN member states who are signatories and who have ratified the convention, and this includes Australia, to being a society that promotes laws, policies, organisations, structures and attitudes that ensure women are guaranteed the same rights as men. General Recommendation 30 of CEDAW, which was adopted in 2013, further clarifies member states' obligations under the convention to ensure women's human rights are protected before, during and after conflict. The General Recommendation also makes clear that CEDAW applies in all conflict and post-conflict settings and addresses the crucial issues facing women. And these issues include violence and challenges in access to justice, education, employment and health. General Recommendation 30 affirms CEDAW's linkages with the second key instrument, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, which was adopted in 2000. SCR 1325 was the landmark peace and security resolution that for the first time recognised the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and girls. It called for the prevention of violence, especially sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls, the stronger protection of women and girls against gender-based violence, and importantly for peacekeeping, greater participation of women in all peace and security efforts, and stronger measures on mainstreaming a gender perspective into peace operations. There are criticisms, of course, from researchers that SCR 1325 just promotes essentialist views of women as peacemakers and has reinforced traditional gender roles and expectations without challenging the systems that oppress women, such as masculinity and power dynamics. Other criticisms include the perpetuation of a binary discourse, which of course is not helpful as we need to promote the inclusion of women, men and other genders. But it did focus member states on the requirement to consider how they could meet these objectives relating to women in peace and security efforts, and it created the conceptual framework that guides the UN's approach to gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping. The third key instrument is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a resolution adopted by the UN at the conclusion of the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995. The Beijing Declaration contains a set of principles concerning the equality of women and men. It advances the rights of women and girls to exercise their freedoms and choices, such as to live free from violence, to go to school, to participate in decisions, and to earn equal pay for equal work. And the Declaration also specifically called for the increased participation of women in conflict and peace processes. Now, these key instruments may sound ancient now, but their relevance is significant. It was also where the term gender mainstreaming as a means to achieve gender equality first came to the world's consciousness. Now, gender mainstreaming is a dual strategy. Firstly, to increase women's equal and meaningful participation in public life on comparable terms with men, and we often call this gender balance or gender parity. But it's not just about increasing numbers. And secondly, to integrate a gender perspective or a gender lens into all public policy programs and development efforts. Now, most governments and international institutions, including the UN, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the World Bank, have demonstrated their agreement on the idea that gender equality and gender mainstreaming are essential components in achieving goals in all areas of development and peace and security. Of course, there are some folks who believe that the considerations of gender have no place in armed forces. Indeed, feminist researchers would argue that adding women to hegemonic masculine institutions does women no favours. And I would say quietly that the instrumental add women and stir approach that militaries adopted when they allowed women in the ranks expected women to conform to those existing historical and patriarchal conditions. But as you will hear at the end of this lecture, this institutional culture of exclusiveness just was. Despite these views, the gender mainstreaming approach has been strongly reinforced by the UN and NATO since the year 2000 and the adoption of SCR 1325 in their respective policies and mandates for peacekeeping missions and operations. The UN in particular has released numerous policies on gender mainstreaming and gender equality in peacekeeping, and too many to discuss here. And the UN Security Council has also adopted a further 9 Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security, which reiterate the need for the increased representation of women and gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping. Now, their policies apply equally to an outward focus of missions and operations in supporting local communities and host countries with reconstruction and security sector reform, as much as an inward focus on mission structures, culture and workplace practices. Indeed, the Security Council resolutions that authorise and amend peace operations specifically include goals to achieve gender equality, and they outline the inward and outward mandates to achieve this. And these can include internally, for example, a commitment to increasing the number of uniformed women, the provision of gender expertise, the conduct of gender training and programs, and applying a gender perspective across all mission areas. And externally, this might include increasing local women's participation in public spaces, preventing sexual and gender-based violence, encouraging civil society input to programs and projects, and ensuring accountability and justice for criminal acts against the local population, of which women are disproportionately the most affected. By way of example, the UN mission in the Central African Republic, or MINUSCA, was established in 2014, with mandates on the protection of civilians, support to the peace process, delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the promotion and protection of human rights. Now, despite the UN's strengthened resolve up until then to mainstream gender, the authorising Security Council resolution for that mission addressed only 5 of those 8 specific gender mandates I just mentioned. There's been a subsequent 7 amending Security Council resolutions for that peace operation since then. And the most recent, adopted in 2021, met all 8 gender mandates, and it specifically stipulated that it would seek to increase the number of women, ensure the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in all aspects of operations, take fully into account gender considerations as a cross-cutting issue throughout its mandate, ensure a safe, enabling and gender-sensitive working environment, ensure uniformed and civilian gender advisors and gender focal points in all mission components, and implement the UN zero tolerance policy on serious misconduct, sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment. Now, of note, the percentage of uniformed women in MINUSCA in 2014 was 1%, but today they comprise 8%, which is just over the total percentage of uniformed women across all UN peace operations. Now, I share this example with you just to demonstrate that integrating gender and ensuring gender equality is not about political correctness. It's clearly taken very seriously by the UN and its Security Council as an operational imperative. It's about observing the human rights of all people, and particularly historically marginalised groups. There has been criticism that this approach has not been sufficient. In 2020, there was a significant increase on global military and arms spending. This is an indicator of increased militarisation, which has strongly been correlated with gender inequality. In addition, a long history of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers continues, and many peacekeepers themselves continue to report sexual harassment and discrimination by other peacekeepers. And this means that gender equality gender inequality is being perpetuated in peacekeeping structures that are consciously or unconsciously embedded in institutional practices. This also means perhaps that policies and mandates on gender equality and gender mainstreaming are not enough in themselves. So what will make the difference? I say gender responsive leadership, not just leadership that complies with policy, but one that actually drives change to benefit all people, one that has a genuine desire to ensure equality for all. Within peacekeeping, leadership is integral to implementing the transformative approach that's needed to respond to and ideally mitigate the gendered, racial and class inequalities that shape both peacekeeping endeavours and the global power hierarchies that lead to violence to begin with. Peacekeepers enter and work in diverse and complex spaces. There's a wealth of scholarship detailing how failing to respond to existing social, political and economic inequalities can undermine any peace that missions are supposed to embed. And where it does not, it perpetuates unequal systems of power. By way of example, research shows that peace agreements that include women are more likely to remain in place years after the peace process. And often preceding this is the need for peacekeeping missions to create the enabling environment for women so that they actually can exercise their rights to participate in the peace process. Conflict and post-conflict conditions create a new set of experiences, both positive and negative, especially for women. And these conditions also create an opportunity for many stagnant social structures to change and thus provide the most radical means for transforming gender roles and relations and achieving equality. And this has as much meaning for the beneficiaries of peacekeeping and aid in a post-conflict setting as it does for the peacekeepers within the masculinised environments of peacekeeping missions. Responsibility for implementing the peacekeeping mandates on gender equality and women's rights rests with those at the highest level of the mission. The head of mission has the overall responsibility to promote and facilitate attention to gender perspectives in all areas of work and demand accountability from managers and staff at all levels. However, a clear commitment to the promotion of gender equality in the entire mission is required from the inception of its mandate to the end and by all staff. Gender responsive leadership places the onus on leaders at all levels to be cognizant of and responsive to biases and discrimination that impact peace operations and the peacekeepers who serve in them. It requires leaders to have the capacity and incentive to achieve institutional goals on gender equality and also to inspire others to see and understand the value in equality benefiting operational effectiveness. Gender responsive leaders go beyond passively supporting gender responsive policies. Instead, they are drivers of meaningful change. And this is particularly the case if they have a more inclusive, intersectional approach to ensure that they do not operate according to homogenised or essentialised understandings of women's and men's experiences. This can also be a feature of domestic gender responsive leadership, such as the implementation of special measures regarding women's participation in the ADF arising from the 2012 Broderick Review. Now, in this case, the Broderick Review sought to address some challenges arising from the Add Women and Stir integrationist approach I mentioned earlier. I think we can all agree that there have been substantial improvements to women's experience in the ADF because of the Broderick Review, not the least the increase in women's participation from 14.2% at the time of the review to 19.2% in 2021. This example demonstrates that gender responsive leadership challenges and mitigates institutional cultures that are rooted in gendered stereotypes, assumptions, or power relations. Now, I'm not here to suggest or debate whether this remains a concern for the ADF. Rather, I wanted to highlight what's required to undertake similar approaches in cultures, countries and communities where women and other marginalised genders are undervalued, subordinate to men and at high risk of gender-based violence. For these reasons and others, gender parity in peacekeeping is also an increasing focus of the UN, and not for the least for the view that a gender-balanced peacekeeping force results in more inclusive policies and practices and contributes to operational effectiveness. But gender-responsive leadership in peacekeeping moves beyond gender parity efforts to challenging the patriarchal environment that can be hostile to women's and others' presence in missions. In these environments, women military and police peacekeepers continue to report harassment, lack of promotions or career development, and taboos and stigmas relating to stepping outside their gendered roles. Gender-responsive leadership can also combat the negative views that are prevalent in the security sector. Research shows that leaders and commanders divide roles, responsibilities and tasks along gendered lines, and they relegate qualified women to roles that do not fully deploy their capabilities. And even recently in the Ukraine, women soldiers fighting on the front line and accommodated in a nearby military facility were relegated the duties of cooking and making tea alongside the same time as cleaning and maintaining their weapons. Another example is the use of engagement teams in peacekeeping, which, while necessary, has seen women siloed into women and community-focused contingents with narrow roles regardless of their areas of expertise. And this is often based on assumptions on the perceived physical risk facing women peacekeepers. The assumption that operational effectiveness is reduced if gender equality is prioritised over other operational goals. The assumption or belief that women are given opportunities to meet representational goals rather than because they have the requisite skills. Gender-responsive leaders can also call out the continued arguments that women add value to peacekeeping missions because of those gender-specific tasks that require women. I think we're past the point of having to continue to justify women's participation to improve operational effect. We can simply ask that as women comprise 50% of the world's population, and given the changes in multi-dimensional peace operations that just require trained professional officers and soldiers, how do men add value? Now, I say that slightly in jest because, of course, the realities of our militaries are the disproportionate gender compositions. But it is time to just agree to utilise both women and men and other genders in ways that allow them to exercise their equal rights and access to opportunities, resources and power. In addition, gender-responsive leadership can lift the burden of gender sensitivity of individual women. Women peacekeepers consistently report the double burden that falls on them as they're seen as the physical embodiments of gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping. Gender-responsive leadership can push back against the idea that gender mainstreaming is only a responsibility for women peacekeepers or gender focal points and gender advisors rather than for all mission personnel. Now, in my own experience as a gender advisor to NATO Operational Command in Afghanistan in 2013, I had great support and gender-responsive leadership shown by the two generals responsible for plans and operations, Australian Major General Gus McLaughlin, whom I'm sure some of you know, and US Marine Corps Lieutenant General Jodie Osterman. Without their support and leadership, I would not have had as much success as I did in implementing gender perspective and analysis into the planning and execution of operations. Major General McLaughlin later observed the following: having expanded my knowledge of the extent to which the effects of conflict fall disproportionately on women and children, I now know that our efforts in Afghanistan would have been better if the principles espoused in UNSCR 1325 had been at the forefront of our planning. The realities that we faced during the operation that displayed the disparity between experiences of conflict along gendered lines demonstrated to me that a gender perspective must be included in the factors shaping our approaches to planning future operations. Those in leadership positions must recognise more actively that when operating in societies affected by violence, mission success can be exponentially enhanced by more actively engaging with women and girls and vulnerable members of society. Now, for myself as a gender advisor, operating alone and without a team, and despite holding O5 rank, it was often quite challenging to implement NATO's policies on gender equality and gender perspective. And it was an environment where most often gender was not well understood as both a variable and a solution in conflict. I was often asked by incoming NATO staff, why are we imposing Western gender equality on Muslim countries? And to which, of course, the answer was, well, gender equality is not a Western notion. It's relevant in all countries, cultures and contexts. And indeed, Afghanistan is actually a good example of where equality between men and women was a constitutional right. NATO was working with the Afghan government to reconstruct their governance, their laws, their judiciary and the security sector, and therefore mainstreaming gender across these areas was a priority for both NATO and the Afghan government. In another example, one of my gender advisor colleagues shares this sentiment from a senior NATO leader she encountered in Afghanistan that, quote, "we're too busy fighting a war to worry about gender," unquote, as though the gender piece was just an add-on, that it meant only women, or that it was about political correctness rather than an operational imperative. And of note, this comment was made during the last NATO operation, Resolute Support Mission, which was a non-combat advise, train and assist mission. And in my view, this comment just demonstrated not only a disregard for NATO's policies, as outlined in the operational plan for the mission, by the way, but ignorance about how gender plays out in conflict, as I've highlighted in this lecture. And sadly, we now see in Afghanistan a country ruled by men and violence, where women's hard-earned rights have been completely eliminated and where women and girls live in fear, without freedom, choice, work or education. Now you know why gender-responsive leadership is necessary. But how about the how? What does this mean for you as military and civilian leaders at home and on deployment? It requires a commitment by you as military experts or staff officers or civilians deployed to peacekeeping missions or in other roles in other operations to not only observe the UN and NATO policy and mandates on gender equality, but to actively demonstrate gender-responsive leadership. What you are being asked to do on mission is no less than what you are being asked to do here, in your capacity as young military and civilian leaders in developing and encouraging safe and inclusive workplaces. So I want to bring this lecture back to what it means for you personally and what you can do. How can you demonstrate gender-responsive leadership behaviours if you're not already doing them? You can arm yourself with knowledge. Look for training opportunities to better understand gender-related issues in peacekeeping and also here at home. Not everyone has to be an expert or trained to the extent that a gender advisor is, but be able to recognise and address, or at least report and communicate gender inequalities that you might see, hear or experience. You can lead by example through the mitigation of gender biases and stereotypes by calling out, for example, day-to-day sexism, sexual harassment or toxic masculine behaviours. You can communicate gender equality initiatives to your team by using gender-inclusive language. And you can do this by challenging yourself and your team to learn and be self-reflective and bring unconscious biases to light. Address the elephants in the room. You can build staff capacity and develop resources to promote equality. Ensure your teams are allocated roles based on skills, experience, knowledge and relevance to the mission at hand. And this generally means having a diverse team that can meet the needs and concerns of a diverse community. You can use a gender lens to examine work routines and work practices to ensure that they consider any gender differences that may prevent women, men, and other genders from accessing an opportunity equally. You can hold yourself and your team accountable for implementing gender equality mandates. You can be a champion for gender equality and call yourself that F word, a feminist. And lastly, given that those of you studying here at ADFA represent a very different cohort to my generation and are far younger and probably more impressive, I have no doubt that you will consider how people's intersections impact their experiences of life, conflict, violence, rights, equality, and access to opportunities. And I'm sure that you will lead your teams in ways that allow them to achieve their fullest potential in peacekeeping and at home. By way of conclusion, I would like to share the story of a friend and colleague of mine, Commodore Heath Robertson, RAN, who reflected on his own leadership in a 2016 publication by the Australian Civil Military Centre on men's leadership on women, peace and security. He records the early days of women serving at sea, where as a junior officer he really failed to appreciate how lonely and isolated the few women on board his ship felt in a crew of over 200 men. And I can tell you that for me, as one of the first two women supply officers and heads of supply departments posted to ships in the mid-1990s, and one of two women in a crew of 212 aboard the destroyer escort HMAS Swan, that experience was very real. And he said of that time, "We judged them on how well they integrated with us, rather than judging ourselves on how well we assisted their integration." The unfairness of that is profound. It was not the result of any deliberate callousness on the part of my shipmates and I. It was simple cluelessness founded upon a prevailing culture where we were all just expected to fit in. Nevertheless, it resides in me as shameful. It reflects a culture of exclusiveness versus inclusiveness. In later sea postings as a commanding officer, he was faced with various cultural challenges in overseas locations that required him to have a greater understanding of gender-related issues, particularly those facing women. And these included dress requirements during a port visit to Saudi Arabia and mixed boarding parties and linguists for ferries carrying refugees. And later he saw the need to ensure the sea training group reflected a gender balance more representative of the women, men and other genders serving at sea. He had his gender-responsive leadership epiphany when, after attending CDF's Conference on Women, Peace and Security in 2014, he implemented measures into all aspects of sea training to ensure consciousness of the practical considerations of gender in operations. His final reflections in his essay, in my view, demonstrate his gender-responsive leadership and that of other leaders who have followed. And he said this: "The Navy and the Australian Defence Force has changed tremendously over the 28 years in which I have served in it. It's a better place to work and reside within. It is kinder. It is more inclusive. It is less tolerant of unacceptable behaviour. It is more intelligent. It is more progressive. It is more adaptable. And for these reasons, I believe it is more capable. For it to be the best it can be, women need to be better represented through all levels of leadership. To be effective on operations, collective training needs to ensure gender and human factors are considered at every level of decision making. This is necessary if the full potential of what UNSCR 1325 can and should be is to be realised. While crucial, UNSCR 1325 is not only about protecting women and harm minimisation. If we are to counter the misinformed in an enduring way, the potential of female influence, shaping and leadership needs to be opened up and the sun brightly shone upon it so that all can see the mockery of not doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for a really thought-provoking lecture. I'm going to invite Officer Cadet Holly Ryan to the stage to deliver the vote of thanks. We'd hoped that we'd have time for questions, but I do not want to be responsible for you all missing dinner. So I'm going to invite Holly up.
Thank you, Professor Sparks and Ms. Wittwer. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening, students and staff, distinguished guests, and those streaming this lecture from across Australia. Ms. Wittwer, it has been an honour to hear from you this evening. Through your work, you have shifted the agenda on women, peace and security within the Australian Defence Force and the broader defence and security sector. As the upcoming generation of ADF leaders, it is pertinent to know, understand and appreciate the role gender has within our workforce and also our society more holistically. Thus, it is a privilege to have the opportunity tonight to learn from a female leader with such extensive experience in both the Australian Defence Force and in women, peace and security. You are an inspiration to myself and my fellow trainee officers, many of whom may follow a similar path to yours. Whether their path takes them abroad or the service is required here at home, I hope they approach the challenges they face with the same strength, poise, and openness that you have demonstrated. As mentioned, combating these issues does not rest upon the shoulders of individuals. Rather, overcoming patriarchal hierarchies requires a whole of community effort, with everyone accepting their role and responsibility in instilling equality for all. This is effective gender-responsive leadership. I hope everyone listening will be able to take something valuable from this evening. I am sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I once again thank you for your words and your time tonight. I'd now like to invite our VIPs to join us in the mezzanine for the post-lecture function. Have a great night, everyone.